Reptiles stand as some of the most feared and deadly creatures on Earth. From the stealthy strike of venomous snakes to the venomous bite of the Komodo dragon, these creatures are known to attack humans. Hit that like button and subscribe right now. These are the most terrifying reptile attacks you'll ever hear. Welcome to Final Affliction.
Jara was a 54-year-old grandmother. She lived with her family in the village of Batara on the Indonesian island of Sumatra. On the 21st of October 2022, she said goodbye to her family and headed off to work for the day. Jara worked in the rubber plantations for decades. Her hours were long and arduous, working through the scorching midday sun. Her job was a trapper. This involved using a knife to cut diagonal lines in the rubber tree bark. Milky white liquid would drip from the cuts she made, which she collected in small plastic cups or coconut shells. The plantation was huge. Row upon row of rubber trees stood as far as the eye could see. Since the year 2000, Indonesia has lost 18% of its tree cover. Deforestation clears ground for agriculture. In the Jambi province where Jara worked in the southeast of the island, rice, corn, tobacco, palm oil, and rubber were produced on a massive scale. The plantations are surrounded by beautiful countryside. In Jambi, the Barisan Mountains and volcanic peaks protrude from the evergreen forests. The lush green valleys are filled with tidal rivers and scattered with mangrove swamps. This habitat is home to a plethora of native wildlife, all of which is competing with an ever-expanding human population. Jara left her home before dawn. The world outside her little house was dark. Only the moon provided a sliver of light for her to see her way through the dense jungle and towards the plantation. Jara earned the equivalent of £1.25 a day. With an extra job on the side and working 7 days a week, Jara managed a monthly salary of just £45 or $55. There was no job security at the plantation. Despite having worked there for over a decade, Jara, like many other workers, was still only employed on a day labor basis and had no formal contract or benefits that would go with that. After Jara had signed in at the plantation that morning, she set to work. She held her knife tight against each tree and made the diagonal incisions. She was focused on the job at hand, waiting until the milky white rubber began flowing before tying her collection beaker underneath it and moving on to the next tree. She didn't hear a stealthy predator approaching her, but suddenly she felt an incredible pain on her back. It was a sharp stabbing pain that made her jump forwards. She dropped her knife in the commotion and felt something wrapped tightly around her body. To her utter horror, a 22-foot-long snake had wrapped itself around Jara's body. Its thick, muscular coil squeezed tighter and ever tighter. Jara gasped as she was pulled to the ground. She took a deep breath as the pressure built around her body. She couldn't move. Her arms were pinned down by her side. The giant snake had taken her completely by surprise. It had ambushed her in the dawn light. She stood no chance of fighting back. The more she wriggled to free herself, the more the snake tightened its suffocating grip. She desperately tried to wriggle free. Her sandals came off her feet as she tried to kick the snake. Her headscarf fell from her head and landed silently to the ground. Jara felt her lungs about to burst. The snake was squeezing so tightly that she couldn't exhale. In a few agonizing minutes, Jara was dead. It was a tragedy. She died alone with no one aware of the horror she was suffering. She had worked every day of her adult life to provide for her family, and they were unlikely to receive any form of compensation for their devastating loss. When Jara no longer struggled, when her body lay still and her heart stopped beating, the snake released its grip. It uncoiled itself from around Jara and slithered towards her head. With its unblinking eyes, it stretched the elastic ligaments holding its lower jaw to its skull, and its mouth opened wide, wider than its own head, wider than Jara's head. Then it started consuming her. Inching its mouth over her body, it enveloped the young grandmother, swallowing her further and further down, working its way over her head, over her shoulders, and down towards her feet. During the course of the day, the snake became severely engorged as it managed to fit Jara's entire body inside its stomach. Reticulated pythons are the longest snakes in the world. They typically range from 1.5 meters in length to 6.5 meters, approximately 5 to 25 feet. But reports of them exceeding these lengths, such as the one that killed Jara, are common. They can weigh as much as 75 kilograms or 165 pounds. At the end of the day, when Jara didn't return home, her husband became worried. He went out searching for her. He followed the usual path she took through the undergrowth to the rubber plantation. She hadn't checked out of work that day. Her husband scouted the plantation, walking down the long rows of trees and calling out her name. Then he came across Jara's jacket on the ground. Next to it lay her sandals and knife. He picked them up and looked around. He called out again, but the silence was deafening. He knew something terrible must have happened to her. He ran back to the village and called for people to help him search. A group followed him to the rubber plantation. As darkness fell, they continued to look for Jara. It was only at 2 a.m. that Jara's husband reluctantly gave up searching for the night and returned home. He reported his wife missing to the local police the next day. They, along with security officials, joined in the search. He took them to the spot where he found Jara's belongings lying on the ground. The search continued. Reports suggested that it wasn't until 2 days later that one of the locals made a shocking discovery. An enormous 7-meter-long snake was laying in the grass. It could barely move. Its body was grossly bulging. One of the locals severed its head, killing it there and then. They dragged it into a clearing. A crowd gathered around. Under the order of Police Chief Harifa, someone took out another knife and ran it along the length of the snake's body, cutting it from head to tail. As the snake opened up, Jara's body spilled out onto the ground. She was completely intact. It was a terrifying shock for the onlookers, something that would haunt her family for the rest of their days. To know that a loved one had been completely consumed by a giant snake was the stuff of nightmares. A spokesman for the village from where Jara lived said that recently some of the villagers had spotted an even bigger python in the area. They estimated that it was at least 27 feet long and had tried to capture it, but it managed to get away. It slithered off into the surrounding forest. Naturally, the locals are concerned that there are such huge snakes living in the forest around their homes. But attacks like this are becoming increasingly common. Although in the grand scheme of things they are a rare occurrence, they are happening more often than before. The reticulated pythons can grow to enormous lengths, but their typical prey is usually much smaller than a human. Often, they prey on pigs and deer or rodents around nesting birds. But with their habitat in sharp decline, they have nowhere to go. They are in direct competition with humans for some of their food sources too. And as their habitat becomes more and more fragmented, they sometimes need to pass through civilization to make their way from one forested area to the next. Human settlements also offer enticing food for these snakes. Rats and domesticated livestock are always within close proximity to people. And whilst humans wouldn't normally be on the menu, the snake's opportunistic nature makes them a formidable predator, though one we should respect, because if we don't, we may just meet our terrifying final affliction.
The exotic pet trade is on the rise. More and more people are buying wild and unique animals, with reptiles being no exception. In fact, reptiles account for more than 2.5 million imports each year in the U.S. The mortality rate for reptiles from capture, transport, and arrival in the U.S. can be as high as 70%, but this doesn't stop some people from buying them. 42-year-old Ronald Huff lived in an apartment in Newark, Delaware. He was an ex-soldier who lived alone. Although he wasn't technically alone, he had a growing collection of 7 monitor lizards. These prehistoric reptiles were free-roaming, allowed into the kitchen, the dining room, and the bedroom. They ambled along, their heads swaying from side to side, their long, whip-like tails dragging behind them. Some of them had grown up to 6 feet long. They looked like Komodo dragons, fearsome and powerful, but to Ronald, they were his family. He had raised them from youngsters, held them and cradled them in his arms, nurtured them. He bred cockroaches in his apartment to feed the lizards, a way of keeping costs down for his growing collection. He also tossed them pieces of raw chicken, which they gulped down without chewing. They were feisty. Each grappled with the others to get a bite. He was a quiet man, keeping himself to himself. He worked at Martin Oldsmobile in Newark and readily became animated when talking about his pet lizards. He was even known as Lizard Boy due to his passion for the venomous reptiles. Some days he would go into work sporting fresh cuts and grazes, as the lizards occasionally bit him. He showed them off to his colleagues. It was all part of the life he had chosen when he took in the reptiles over the years. He was lucky that they were only minor bites inflicted by the lizards, and he was lucky that their venom wasn't enough to kill a man. But one day, his luck ran out. No one knows for sure what happened on January 16, 2002, but Ronald's neighbors, Jeff Wildonger, detected a smell filling his bathroom. It was coming in through the hollow walls from Ron's apartment and into his, a smell of rotting flesh, the smell of decay. Ronald hadn't been seen for days. The following is merely a suggestion of what could have happened to Ronald. It is a dramatization. And although it has happened before, no one knows for sure if this is how it played out this time. It was feeding time. Ronald walked over to his refrigerator and opened the door. The monitor lizards knew the routine. The sound of the fridge door opening induced the anticipation of food. Saliva filled their mouths as they eyed Ronald hungrily. He bent down to take out the tub of raw chicken. As he did so, one of the monitor lizards snapped at him. It caught him on the arm and drew blood. Ronald recoiled and jumped up. His startled reaction only spurred the others on. They were crawling around his feet. Some began to pull themselves up onto their hind legs, trying to climb up Ronald to reach the raw meat. Their excitement was dangerous. Their eyes were fixated on the tub of fresh meat in Ronald's hand. He lifted it above his head as the biggest of the lizards lunged upwards. Quickly, Ronald, opening the tub, threw lumps of chicken at the reptiles. They caught the meat mid-air, throwing their heads back to help it slip down their throats and into their hungry bellies. But when the chicken was finished, the reptiles were still hungry. They had an insatiable appetite now that they were growing bigger and bigger. Another lizard lunged at Ronald again. He knew he needed to get out of the apartment quickly until they calmed down. But in his rush to get out the front door, he tripped and fell to the floor. The lizards were upon him in no time. Their razor-sharp teeth sliced into his flesh. They tore at his legs and arms and latched onto his face. The ex-soldier could have easily pushed one of them off, but with 7 all tucking into him, he struggled to fight back. Their combined weight pinned him to the ground. He reached the front door and made one last attempt to open it, but it was too late. When officers arrived on scene, they knocked on Ronald's front door. There was no answer. They heard a scuttling noise coming from the other side of the door. There was movement in there. It was coming from someone or something. They knocked again, calling out to the young man before deciding to force entry. As they did so, they pushed the door open. Something was blocking the way. Finally, they managed to open the door just enough to peer around and into the apartment. A stench filled their nostrils. They gagged and covered their mouths. Then they stepped into the room. There, on the floor, was Ronald's body. slumped against the door, and right there, feasting on it, were all 7 of his pet monitor lizards. They hissed at the officers, their forked tongues flicking outwards as they smelled the intruders. Their faces were speckled with blood. Their snouts were stained red. Ronald's face had been almost totally devoured. His molar teeth were visible as his skin and flesh had been torn from the side of his face. The officers managed to force their way into the apartment, ushering the lizards away. But the monitors were protective of their kill. They threatened to bite the policemen whilst they looked around the apartment for more clues. The lizards were captured by wildlife officials and rehomed in wildlife sanctuaries. The most aggressive lizard was put down. It was too much of a threat, and they were unsure if it had been responsible for its owner's death. An autopsy on Ronald proved inconclusive. Nobody could tell whether Ronald had died of natural causes and then the lizards had feasted on his dead body, or whether the lizards had turned on him and killed him. A police officer who had been there when the lizard boy was discovered suspected the latter. He was convinced the lizards had inflicted severe wounds on their owner before eating him alive. The way Ronald was slumped on the floor in front of the door suggested that he was trying to leave the apartment. Maybe they had turned on him. If all 7 of them had launched an attack, then he may have been overpowered by them, especially as a few of the specimens were a hefty weight at 6 feet long. The evidence he had been attacked by them before, bearing the wounds for his colleagues to see, suggested that the lizards were aggressive towards him. Had the lizards he had nurtured for so long betrayed his trust? Had they finally turned on him? The answers are not clear, but this is a very real possibility, and attacks like this have been known to happen before. Keeping exotic animals may be interesting and exciting, but they come with their risks, and purchasing these creatures is only going to fuel the illegal pet trade. When you think of dangerous animals, the most common ones that people think of are sharks, bears, and other large creatures like that. However, one of the most deadly creatures to exist today is one that has hardly changed for millions of years, the crocodile. And they are just as deadly today as they were back during prehistoric times. This story happened in the country of Costa Rica. The country itself is rugged and holds large rain-forested areas, hardly touched by humans. Costa Rica is known for its beautiful beaches, fascinating volcanoes, and its immense biodiversity. Roughly a quarter of its area is made up of protected jungle, teeming with wildlife, including spider monkeys and quetzal birds. However, Costa Rica is also home to the largest number of American crocodiles in the world, which is what this story is about. There are 2 main species of crocodile in Costa Rica, the American crocodile and the spectacled caiman. Whilst you would not want to meet either one in the water, it is the American crocodile which you need to look out for. These reptiles can grow up to 6 meters in length, although there have been some cases of them growing even larger. As adults, they can also reach over 2,000 pounds in weight, all of which is pure muscle. Crocodiles and caimans are carnivorous, meaning that they only eat meat, and they aren't fussy about where it comes from either. They will eat anything they can catch, from birds to fish, iguanas, turtles, deer, and even humans. Anything is fair game to these reptiles. It is not easy to avoid these animals either, as they tend to reside in rivers, swamps, lagoons, small islands, and have been known to even venture into the ocean every now and again. But the thing that makes them so scary is that they are extremely efficient hunters. Crocodiles are very patient animals, and their hunting tactics revolve around their ability to wait for hours on end. The reptiles hunt by stealthily stalking their prey from the water. Once it has caught its prey, it becomes practically impossible for it to escape. This is because crocodiles have the strongest bite force in the world, and once they clamp their jaws onto their prey, they don't often let it go again. With the struggling prey in its jaws, a crocodile will then drag the other animal into the water and drown it. It then eats its prey by biting off large chunks of meat and swallows them whole. not a fate that anyone would wish to meet. However, some people aren't that lucky. Jesus Alberto Lopez Ortiz, nicknamed Chuco, was a 29-year-old man who lived in a small village near the town of Santa Cruz in Costa Rica. He had lived there all his life and had managed to make a bit of a name for himself by becoming a semi-professional football player for his local team. He also had a wife and 2 children, who he loved dearly. And whilst he wasn't necessarily rich, Jesus loved his life as he got to play his favorite sport for money. Like lots of football teams, Jesus and his teammates often had to meet up for training sessions. It was whilst Jesus was doing one of these sessions, though, that tragedy struck. It had been an incredibly hot day in July 2023 in Costa Rica, and Jesus and his team were exhausted from their training session. The sun had been beating down on them all day long, and the group of men were sweltering underneath its blistering rays. As Jesus looked over at the nearby river, it was then that he had an idea. The water looked so inviting and cool that the young man simply couldn't help but throw himself into it. Whilst this might have seemed like a great way to cool down at first, it quickly became apparent that it was one of the most deadliest ideas Jesus had ever had. The river that he had jumped into was the Cañas River, an area of water where crocodiles were known to inhabit. Not thinking about the dangers which could be lurking nearby, Jesus began to bathe himself in the river. All the young man knew was that he was hot and sweaty and that he wanted to clean himself up a bit. However, the conditions of the river did not help Jesus' chances of avoiding a crocodile. The water was murky and almost impossible to see through. This meant that any dangerous reptile swimming in it would not be seen until they decided to make their presence known. And, sadly, the inevitable happened. In one moment, Jesus was happily washing himself in the water, laughing to his teammates back on the shore. And in the next, he had disappeared. Jesus' teammates couldn't believe what they had just witnessed. It had been mere seconds, but Jesus had been dragged under the water in the blink of an eye. At first, the team chuckled a little bit, thinking that Jesus was simply playing a trick on them. It wouldn't have been the first time that the young man tried to trick them. However, when the thrashing began, they soon understood that the situation was not a laughing matter. Meanwhile, the 29-year-old footballer was stuck in the jaws of a huge crocodile, and it was hungry. Jesus tried his hardest to make the animal let go of him, hitting it in the face with as much strength as he could, but the crocodile was unfazed. Instead, the deadly reptile began to go into a death roll. This is a tactic crocodiles use in order to subdue and disorient their prey. The reptile begins spinning incredibly fast, rotating as many times as it can, all whilst keeping their prey in their mouth. The shock of the spinning and how violent it is often causes the prey to gasp out for air. However, because they are underwater, this leads to drowning in most cases, and this is exactly what happened to Jesus. His teammates, along with the crowd which had formed along the bank of the river, watched in horror as Jesus and the crocodile thrashed around in the water. What seemed like hours later, although it was actually only minutes, the thrashing came to an end, and the water became still again. Then, rising from the depths of the river, a sight which truly traumatized those who saw it. The crocodile rose to the top of the river, carrying Jesus' body in its mouth. The deadly reptile proceeded to swim around with Jesus' body, clearly making sure that no other predator could get its hard-fought-for meal. Not willing to leave their friend's body in the jaws of the crocodile, volunteers began trying to separate the reptile from Jesus. Sadly, despite many attempts to do this peacefully, the crocodile simply wouldn't release the footballer. Seeing that there was no other choice, a local grabbed his gun from his house and shot the crocodile. Once the animal was dead, the volunteers then ventured into the river to retrieve both the animal's body and Jesus's. Whilst Costa Rica's Ministry of Environment and Energy prohibits the hunting or killing of protected animals such as crocodiles, an investigation was not carried out, as it was made clear that the locals only did it as a last resort. Once Jesus' body was safely back on land, his family decided to bury him in the local cemetery. However, they could never have known just how many people the 29-year-old footballer had touched in his lifetime. On the day of his funeral, Jesus' procession was attended by over 1,000 people, all of which were either his friends and family or people that he had helped during his life. Because football had been his passion, all of Jesus' teammates and his coach attended the funeral. When it came time to give their eulogies, the team's coach said that Jesus would be remembered as a humble, helpful, and calm person, well-liked by his teammates, a testimony that could be attested to considering the amount of people who attended his funeral. Because of the attack, the Costa Rican government has started to investigate ways that they can make bodies of water more safe for people. They hope to reduce the amount of deadly interactions between humans and crocodiles, which hopefully will result in better harmony between the two species and prevent more people like Jesus Ortiz from meeting their terrifying final affliction. Komodo dragons are the stuff of nightmares, with a mouth full of sharp, serrated teeth to tear flesh from bone, a long forked tongue that can smell its prey from 5 miles away, and a venom that causes the victim to internally bleed to death. They are one of the most feared reptiles on the planet. There are thought to be only 4,000 Komodo dragons left in the wild. They inhabit just 5 Indonesian islands, which are Komodo, Rinca, Flores, Gili Dasami, and Gili Motong. They are renowned as carrion eaters, tucking into carcasses and consuming up to 80% of their body weight in one sitting. However, when the opportunity arises, they are also exceptional ambush predators. Typically, they prey on small animals such as invertebrates, birds, reptiles, eggs, and monkeys. Larger dragons will eat wild boar, goats, deer, horses, and even water buffalo. They have a disturbing habit of digging up graves and feeding on the corpses beneath. This has led locals to bury their dead in clay soils and pile rocks on top to prevent the lizards from gaining access to their loved ones. It is no wonder the Komodo dragons have such a fearsome reputation. It is what drives tourists to the Indonesian islands, the chance to see the largest and heaviest lizards in the world. In March 2009, 31-year-old Muhammad Anwar set out to pick fruit on the island of Komodo. Nobody knows for sure what happened leading up to the attack, but the following story is thought to be the most probable scenario of what happened to him on that fateful day. It was a warm, sunny day, and as Muhammad walked through the groves, his scent was picked up by a pair of Komodo dragons that were on the prowl. Due to habitat destruction, Komodo dragons are becoming increasingly more problematic for humans as they search further to find food. Amongst the fruit trees, the giant lizards flicked their forked tongues in and out. The chemoreceptors on the roof of their mouths alerted them to a meal several hundred meters away. Silently, they closed in. Their heavy footsteps were silent in the tall grass. Their heads swayed from side to side. Muhammad was unaware of his impending doom. Conflicting reports suggest that he was either working in the fields as a fruit picker or he was trespassing. Komodo National Park's general manager, Franciscus Harum, said that it was forbidden to go into that area of the park and that Muhammad was a fisherman who had strayed from the beach to search for fruit. There was a reason the area was forbidden to enter. It was home to a large population of Komodo dragons and was deemed too dangerous for the general public. But others believed he was working in one of the fruit groves there, picking apples to provide for his family. In Komodo, besides the tourism industry, fruit picking and fishing provide the main income for locals. Whatever his reason for being there, Muhammad was about to find himself in a sticky situation. The 31-year-old climbed the apple tree. He hauled himself up through the branches, reaching the choicest fruit at the top of the tree and placing it into his bag. He was about to climb back down and climb another tree when he spotted something on the ground. It was large, a flash of dark green and gray. He lowered himself down slightly, holding on with both his hands as he peered through the branches. Then his heart leapt in his chest as he realized he was surrounded by not one, but 2 Komodo dragons. They were enormous, weighing around 70 kilograms or 150 pounds, and stretching to 2.5 meters or 8.5 feet long. He watched intently as he contemplated his next move. He decided to wait it out, but the Komodo dragons weren't just passing by. They were there for him. He was their prey. The scent of the young man had enticed them from the tree line. They were searching for their next meal, and at last they had found it. One of them reared up on its hind legs and placed its front claws on the tree trunk. Muhammad felt the trunk shake under the weight of the lizard as it leaned against it, supported by its thick, muscular tail. He knew they could climb trees. There was very little a Komodo dragon couldn't do. Not only could they ascend trees, but they were excellent swimmers, could run at speeds of up to 12 miles per hour, and females could reproduce without involving a male. To Muhammad's relief, however, this one was too heavy to climb up the tree and lowered itself back down to the ground. But he was stuck. The animals below him circled the tree. He watched them, observing their characteristic lumbering gait. Every now and then they would pause and look upwards, eyeing the young man with interest. The tongues flicked in and out of their mouths. He could see their armored, scaly skin and their powerful tails. He cried out, hoping that some of the other workers would hear him, but nobody answered. He was torn. Should he make a run for it, or should he try and wait it out? As the heat of the day drained him and sweat poured from his face, he shuffled uneasily on the branch he was perched on. With only apples to keep him hydrated, he knew his options were limited. He readjusted his grip on one of the branches, but as he did so, his sweaty palm slipped on the smooth bark of the apple tree, and he lost his footing. Muhammad went crashing to the ground. He was whipped and smacked by the other branches as he plummeted downwards. The wind was knocked from his lungs as he landed on the hard ground. Then they were upon him. Muhammad had no time to get up. He immediately felt the hungry meat-eaters tearing into his flesh. It was like a feeding frenzy. Each of their mouths contained 60 serrated teeth designed for tearing through meat and causing severe damage and exsanguination. The force of their bite could break a man's leg in two. They were merciless. At last, their long wait for a meal was over. The two dragons hissed as they attacked their victim. Muhammad cried out in pain. He desperately tried to fight the lizards off, but their frenzied attack gave him no room to maneuver. Eventually, Theresia Tawa heard the desperate cries for help and ran through the fruit grove. When she reached Muhammad, she was shocked at the sight. Blood poured from the young man's body. He was thrashing about on the ground, kicking and punching and screaming. He was fighting back as hard as he could. Theresia threw stones at the giant lizards and yelled at them. They paused momentarily and looked up. Theresia screamed at them again, and they scuttled off into the undergrowth. She rushed to Muhammad's side and cradled his head in her hands. Large, gaping wounds had been torn by their teeth. The venom was now coursing through his body, preventing the blood from clotting. Soon muscle paralysis, hypothermia, shock, and loss of consciousness would set in. Muhammad needed urgent medical attention if he had any chance of survival, but hospitals were few and far between on the Indonesian islands. He was carried to the shore and lifted into a fisherman's motorboat. They sped across the water to a medical clinic on the nearby island of Flores. Tragically, Muhammad died on arrival at the clinic from massive blood loss before doctors were able to save him. This tragic incident was one of many increasing attacks across the islands, only adding to the fear that surrounds the endangered reptiles. Only the month before, a dragon climbed up a ladder and into the house of a park ranger, mauling him whilst he slept. Although he survived, it was a harrowing experience. The previous year, 5 tourists were swept onto the island of Rinca after being caught by strong currents whilst diving. Arriving on the soft sand in the dead of night, they didn't realize that their ordeal was just beginning. As sunlight emerged, they came face to face with a Komodo dragon and spent 5 days fending it off whilst waiting for rescue. And a couple of years before that, an 8-year-old local boy was pounced upon by a dragon whilst playing football with his friends. Sadly, he didn't live to tell the tale. An increasing number of encounters are thought to be due to the loss of the Komodo dragon's habitat. As more of it is cleared to make way for agriculture and housing, the giant lizards have no choice but to search elsewhere for food. Living in such close proximity to people is bound to end in conflict. They are drawn to the rural communities by the promise of food. Domesticated goats and chickens are easy meals for the lizards, and although humans aren't their typical prey, they will attack if they feel threatened or if they are really, really hungry. The Komodo dragons who attacked Muhammad that day were apparently just that, leading to his terrifying final affliction. Nestled off the coast of Louisiana is a barrier island surrounded by crystal clear waters and lush marshlands, the Grand Isle. It not only brags of its long, sandy beaches and endless skies above it, but this island is also home to a vibrant ecosystem ranging from pelicans to dolphins. Its marshlands are a mesmerizing blend of blues, browns, and greens. However, deep within the murky waters of the marshlands are one of the most ancient reptiles to ever roam the planet: alligators. They move fast and strike without remorse, posing a deadly threat to those who don't exercise caution in this territory. On the 23rd of August, 2021, meteorologists noted with concern as a tropical wave in the Caribbean Sea gave birth to Hurricane Ida. By the 27th of the same month, the hurricane had undergone rapid intensification, gaining sustained winds of over 240 kilometers per hour, with the central pressure considerably over 929 millibars. This was a cause for alarm, as it meant that the hurricane was Category 4, capable of destruction of property worth billions of dollars, and even worse, the eventual loss of human life. On the 29th, 6 days after its rise, Hurricane Ida finally made landfall on Port Fourchon, Louisiana, creating havoc in the town of Grand Isle. As expected, the Category 4 hurricane brought with it a wrath of devastation. The streets turned to rivers as the waters broke their barriers and forcefully made new paths for themselves. Homes were being washed away while the cars floated aimlessly. Power lines were knocked down and the trees uprooted, transforming the lively Grand Isle into a desolate wasteland. Tim Satterley was a 71-year-old resident of Slidell, which is north of Grand Isle. Tim's neighborhood was also surrounded by marshes whose water levels were quickly rising in the storm. Luckily, his raised house towered above the floodwaters and was one among the few that had weathered the heavy rains and wild winds of Hurricane Ida. He was a man who never got tired of helping out at every chance he got, and out of his good heart, he volunteered as a cook to help those who had been battered by the hurricane, leaving them with no access to food, shelter, and other essential supplies. On the 30th, a day after the heavy storm, Tim was with his wife at home when he found the need to go outside to check on something in the shed behind his house. The storm, which had brought with it the water from the surrounding marshes and all manner of things, flooded the area, surrounding the house like a moat. Suddenly, his wife Sandy heard a heavy splashing sound and feared that Tim had lost his footing and fallen into the flood. She instinctively rose from her rocking chair and dashed out to help her husband. She had no idea that she was in for a rude shock. Sandy, who was expecting to find her husband drenched in the cold and dirty water, was not ready for what she saw. She found her husband being attacked by a 12-foot-long alligator that had locked him in a death roll. She watched as the 500-pound alligator rolled and twisted and was propelled by its powerful tail. In the process, it ended up tearing Tim's arm from his body. She quickly dashed back to the house and grabbed anything her hands could reach to help her fight off the gator. On returning to aid her husband, she saw the gator disappear under the brown, dirty water, with Tim's arm tightly secured between its sharp teeth. Tim lay in a pool of his own blood that was beginning to stain the water. He was unconscious. Sandy quickly dragged him out of the water and left him near their front porch before dashing back into the house for her phone to call for help. Unfortunately, there was neither power nor cell service, but the horrific sight of her dear husband was enough to drive her to the greatest lengths just to get him help. She knew that the only way to get cell service was by moving to a higher point, but with no clue of the alligator's whereabouts, she feared that it could still be nearby, stalking her, patiently waiting to strike. However, Sandy had unwavering love and devotion for her lifelong companion, and she was willing to dance with death for the sake of her husband. She got into the water and rowed away in a canoe while searching for a signal to call 911. Amid her gasps for air, as she tried to compose herself, she made a mayday call to St. Tammany Parish Sheriff's Office and notified them of the unfortunate incident. After the call, she noticed that she had paddled farther from her house as expected. She gasped. There was no one to guard her helpless husband. With her heart loudly pounding in her chest, Sandra quickly paddled back to the house, deftly avoiding the aimlessly floating cars and debris along the way. She arrived at the house almost at the same time as the first responders, where they were met with a shocking discovery. Tim's unresponsive body was no longer where she had placed him on the porch. She frantically searched the house, methodically checking each room, but he was nowhere to be seen. Tim had vanished. The only sign of his existence was the pool of blood by the porch that had been partially washed away by the floodwater. The officers scanned the surrounding area, but their search was futile. Assumptions were made that the alligator that had earlier taken off with his arm had returned to claim the rest of him when Sandy paddled away to call for help. However, Tim Satterley could not be presumed dead without the body. The officers will always presume a victim to be alive and missing unless the person has been involved in an unsurvivable catastrophe or they have been missing for 5 consecutive years. The assumptions the alligator returned for Tim to eat him were therefore just that, assumptions. The officers couldn't declare Tim deceased without his body. They needed to find him. Sheriff's deputies and Louisiana wildlife and fisheries agents began investigations to locate both the alligator and Tim's body. With over 2 million gators in Louisiana, they knew that the search for the culprit responsible was an uphill task, whose success was next to nil. But with the missing body still at bay, they were ready to gamble their odds. They set traps around the surrounding marshes and scoured the area on foot with cadaver dogs and drones from above. Luckily, 2 weeks after Tim disappeared, a drone captured a large 12-foot-long alligator near where the attack happened. The authorities trapped it and noted that it weighed 504 pounds in weight. It fit perfectly with the descriptions that Sandy had given them on the unforgettable day of the attack. The authorities then shot it between the eyes, and the bullet went straight and deep into its skull. This was necessary in ensuring that the merciless predator would never get to kill and attack another human being. The reptile was then transported to a secure lab for a necropsy, where wildlife agents cut it open, revealing chunks of human remains in its stomach. Elements of a human face still intact were also discovered. However, the human remains were yet to be confirmed as those belonging to Tim Satterley. DNA samples were collected from Tim's sons, who would have similar DNA as Tim's, and the results showed 11 points in comparison that matched the human body parts found in the alligator's stomach. Teeth and part of the jawbone that was found also underwent analysis under a forensic odontologist, and the findings were consistent with Tim's dental records. The investigations led to a conclusive finding that this alligator was the culprit responsible for stalking, killing, and eating Tim Satterley. As horrible as it is, it was still a bit comforting to his devastated family that his remains had been found and the alligator was gone. They could now lay him to rest. Tim's fatal attack was the first of its kind in Louisiana in almost 200 years. Despite 2 million alligators living in its lush green marshlands on a daily basis, and numerous attacks over the years, the unusual circumstances surrounding Tim Satterley's death makes it one of the most terrifying animal attacks ever recorded. A hurricane can flood the streets within minutes and bring with it all of the predators that swim in the water. If you ever find yourself in a flood, do your best to stay out of the water, or you might just meet your final affliction. As symbols of death and the devil, snakes have always been a particularly divisive animal and tend to have a drastically different effect on different people. Some hate them and squirm at the idea of being anywhere near one, whereas others love them so much that they want to keep them in their homes. It is estimated that over 160,000 snakes are currently kept as pets in Canadian homes, and with few regulations about the breeding of these animals, there can be issues regarding their behavior, which can result in tragedy. Regardless of personal opinion about the animal, it is generally agreed that snakes, especially very large ones, should be correctly enclosed and kept away from children. Unfortunately, this was not the case when Noah and Connor Barth entered the home of a family friend who owned an exotic pet store, a home that they would never leave. When 6-year-old Connor and his 4-year-old brother Noah were invited to a sleepover next door at a friend's house to see the animals that were held in the home, they were very excited. Even at this young age, they were already very interested in animals, and the idea of being able to get closer to them than any zoo would ever allow made the invite even more enticing. The friend's father was Jean-Claude Savoie, and he owned the local exotic pet store. He loved being able to show off his collection to children, believing that the interest might stick and lead to a lifelong hobby. The boys regularly spent the night over at his house, as his son was close friends with the boy, and so Jean-Claude was seen as an extension of the family. He cared for the boys very much and considered them to be his other sons, so he would always make sure they were happy and well taken care of. They spent their day playing in the garden, interacting with goats, rabbits, cats, and dogs. They held the snakes and played in the empty tanks. To end the day, Jean-Claude took them out in his tractor, even letting them steer it, which they were delighted by. When they were finished, they cleaned themselves up and headed to bed around midnight. The brothers were set up in the living room on the sofa, while Jean-Claude and his son slept in their rooms. The boys were excited to be sleeping at their friend's house, and the idea that tomorrow they would be playing with even more animals made them barely able to sleep. Sadly, the boys would never wake again. Unbeknownst to anyone in the apartment, one of the exotic animals was planning an escape that night. In the room adjacent to where the young boys were sleeping, there was a 100-pound, 14-foot African rock python with an open vent above it. The species was illegal in Canada unless the owner had a specific license, which Jean-Claude did not have. But the man believed that it was a welcome addition to his collection, which he enjoyed showing off to people. The snake was not friendly, and at times was particularly aggressive towards humans, as it was a timid animal and would attack when scared. The animal had already attempted to escape earlier in the week through the vent, but it had gotten stuck, leading Jean-Claude to believe that the snake was too big to ever escape through the hole, and so it wouldn't need to be covered up or fixed. This was a decision that would cause the disastrous results of that night. The snake was hungry. It hadn't been fed in the last 24 hours, and so it was forced to try to find its own food. In its malnourished state, it was much smaller, which meant that it was now able to fit into the vent and found its way into the ventilation shaft. It slowly slithered through the shaft, moving from room to room as it tried to figure out where it could get its next meal. Although it was slim enough to fit through the shaft, its 100-pound weight began to take a toll on the ventilation shaft, and when it was making its way over the living room, it fell. Pythons will naturally constrict if they are in danger, and so, when the snake finally fell onto something, it grasped it tightly and continued to constrict. There was a smell of farm animals that filled the room. and so the snake concluded that the thing it had grabbed onto was a prey animal. Unfortunately, the snake was incorrect, and it had in fact fallen on top of the sleeping brothers. The smell was coming from them, as they had been playing on the farm all day, but the snake was not able to differentiate this. It could smell prey, and so it would treat the boys as it would any other prey. The boys initially tried to struggle, but were immediately overpowered. The snake was made of pure muscle, and the boys were no match for such prehistoric power. It began to constrict more, wrapping itself around the necks of the boys and biting mercilessly at the children's faces. As the children stopped struggling, the snake continued to bite and squeeze the children, either in an attempt to stabilize itself after the fall or because it was attempting to eat its prey. It is thought that the boys passed away quite quickly as the snake squeezed harder and gradually suffocated them. Although it would have been initially painful and terrifying for the children, we can only hope that it was over quickly and as painlessly as possible. Despite the speed of the attack, the snake did not try to consume the children and instead left them where it had killed them, their lifeless bodies giving the impression that they were peacefully sleeping. Jean-Claude woke up early and came into the living room at 6:30 a.m. He saw the children on the floor, and in the dim light, he could see their sleeping faces, and so continued into the kitchen quietly so that he wouldn't wake them. He accidentally made some noise in the kitchen and peeked out to check on the boys, expecting the sound to have woken them up, but they hadn't moved. This was unusual, and Jean-Claude started to have a bad feeling about the entire situation. He flicked on the lights to double-check when he saw the collapsed ceiling and debris across the floor. The boys still hadn't moved, so he initially worried that the debris had hurt the children, but then he saw his snake waiting in the corner. He looked at the animal and then at the boys and realized what had happened. The boys were blue. His snake had killed them. He ran out of the room to the boys' mother's house, banging on her door and shouting for her. "Oh my God! Your kids are dead." Mandy heard the words echo through her hallway, and her heart stopped. Her boyfriend ran from the house to check next door, and when he returned, his face was white. "It's true. It's a f***ing nightmare, but it's true." Mandy's world ended with those words. The tragedy hit the news worldwide, and thousands of people sent prayers to the family of the two young boys who were killed in such an unfortunate and graphic way. The snake was taken from the scene and euthanized by a vet who commented on how aggressive the animal was. Mandy began legal proceedings against Jean-Claude for criminal negligence, causing death, to avenge her children. But she knew that nothing would ever be good enough. She would never get her children back. During the case, they found that Jean-Claude had been warned by other reptile owners that he needed to cover the vent as soon as possible, as the snake would be able to escape. But he took his time to get it fixed, thinking that the animal was too large to fit through. What he didn't take into account is the amount that snakes can contract their muscles, especially when they haven't been fed. To convict the snake owner for criminal negligence, the court needed to answer 3 questions. 1. Did he fail in his duty as an adult to protect the children? 2. Did he show reckless disregard for their safety? 3. Did he fail to take appropriate measures to protect the children, causing their death? After 3 years of court proceedings, Jean-Claude Savoie was found not guilty, and the case was dropped against him. Although their mother was disappointed with the result, it didn't matter to her. She would still have to continue life without her children, who at the hands of her friend met their terrifying final affliction.